Hello and welcome back to the Political Risk Podcast, where geopolitics and specialty insurance markets meet. You're listening to a new special episode produced in association with Concirrus. Our theme is active assailant risk, data demands for a deadly peril. I'm your host, David Benyon. And I'm joined by two expert guests. Gamze Tekin is a senior product owner at Concirrus, and Joshua Watson is a senior underwriter for war and terrorism North America at Markel International. In the crisis management space, Josh has developed a focus on underwriting active assailant for Markel's US book of business. A seasoned insurance professional with a focus on national middle market risk solutions, he leads a dynamic team delivering innovative risk and insurance strategies for complex clients. Gamze Tekin works at the intersection of political violence risk, underwriting decision-making, and applied AI. Concirrus has created an AI-native underwriting workbench, built for the specific requirements of commercial and specialty insurance. In her role, Gamze leads the development of tools that are helping specialty underwriters to make confident calls on complex and fast-moving risks. With experience spanning specialty insurance technology and international policy research, she brings technical depth and geopolitical awareness to conversations that matter. Our conversation takes place in three sections. In the first section, we get to know Josh and Gamze, discuss their respective roles and backgrounds, and ask how active assailant has risen to become such a pressing topic. We then ask what makes active assailant such an interesting, challenging, and unique peril that stands out quite distinctly within crisis management and political violence as an overall class of business. We look at how protection works, the triggers, changes in the risk landscape, portfolio exposure from an underwriter's perspective, and new and incoming US regulation related to workplace violence. The third section focuses on the data gap to underwrite active assailant, some of the underwriting tools, data and analytics, from real-time risk visibility to aggregation and portfolio level management. So why is this episode important? Anyone who follows the news will know that active assailant attacks are on the rise. Lone wolf gunmen and active assailants pose a real threat to workplaces and public spaces, particularly in the US, and the effects of these incidents can be devastating. Why is this episode different? Well, for insurers, active assailant tends to sit within a crisis management or political violence underwriting book, alongside perils like terrorism and war risk, but it's very different from those perils that tend to focus on physical damage to property, and as a frequency peril sitting alongside severity perils in a PV portfolio. And that poses some unique challenges for underwriters. So let's get into this fascinating and unfortunately increasingly relevant corner of the specialty insurance business. Enjoy the episode. A big welcome to Gamze and to Josh. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to do an episode devoted to active assailant risk for some time, and because it's cropped up in so many episodes in passing or to some degree, and it really is worth, I think, having a conversation in its own right. I'm sure Josh is nodding because it's one of his major focuses as an underwriter. And not every PV underwriter is willing to say they focus on active assailant, and we'll get into the reasons why for that in due course. But Josh, could I kick off with yourself a question? So could you just start by explaining your own role at Markel and how you moved? I know you were a broker before you were an underwriter, and your current book of business, active assailant and terrorism book, what it looks like.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. I sit in Markel's North America political violence and terror team. My focus is on active assailant, terrorism risk, two very closely connected coverages. They're increasingly converge, yet, as we're talking here today, remain widely misunderstood. As you mentioned, came into underwriting from a retail broking background. I was there almost 15 years. It gives me a very practical lens on how clients buy the coverage. And it gives me a look into kind of the bridge that needs to happen between underwriting and what the client actually needs. Today, my book is really focused on helping insureds manage a growing, yet really real exposure, not just through insurance limits, but crisis response, intelligence and underwriting, and a more joined up approach to active assailant and terrorism risk. The biggest thing is that we just want to be able to provide the clients with what they need in this ever-changing, ever-growing environment.
And it's a North American book. All the clients are North America.
Correct. With my team, we are 100% North America focused. Markel, we do have an international arm, but I focus 100% on North America.
Gamze, let's turn to you then. So please explain your own role and also
in the same way as Josh was explaining the book of business, would you mind explaining the Underwriter Workbench product to give more of an understanding of what that is, what it does? And perhaps also when you're talking about your own role, how you got here. So your background in geopolitics and international relations shaping the role you're doing today.
Thank you, Dave. I'm really happy to do that. So a little bit about me. So I work as a senior product owner at Concirrus. It's an insurtech platform operating in London, but we do have a lot of clients from North America region as well. And I predominantly work with our PVNT product, what we call as our underwriter workbench. So what we try to do is we work with underwriters like Joshua to empower them to really understand their pain points and to provide them an end-to-end platform that enables them to underwrite risk more effectively, manage their portfolio, do all the administrative tasks, and take the burden away from them so that they can really devote their time to valuable tasks. So it's an AI-powered platform that I work in the product team to constantly develop and innovate based on my discussions with clients and the market research. So that's what I do. And I really enjoy my job. And how I found myself in this position in this industry, there's a good phrase that I love to say, you found yourself in insurance, like it finds you. I don't know, Joshua, yeah, he's nodding and agreeing with me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I studied politics and international relations and then went on to study global management. And I did internships in UN, in governmental organizations. I really enjoyed that work too. And it gave me a very unique perspective on how to understand risk. But then I found myself in the world of insurtech, and it's really fascinating. And it's like the nexus of risk management, politics, and management. So I really enjoy what I do, and that's how I ended up here.
I think I found myself in insurance in a very positive vibe.
Yeah.
Too often people use the phrasing of "I fell into insurance" as if it's like a sort of deep dark hole the nexus between insurance and geopolitics. I mean, that's all about why this podcast exists. But a question to you both to start with. This is an evolving line of business or class of business, more broadly political violence and certainly active assailant within it. I think we're all quite used to saying, unfortunately, because obviously it is an unpleasant act that we are insuring against. But then again, so is every other insurance line. It's all about whether it's natural catastrophe or misfortunes. That's what insurance is there for. So yet again, we should probably have a positive vibe and say our role ought to be positive in this. So that's all reflection really. But the question is, what's changed, do you think, to both of you in the last maybe 5 or 6 years to make active assailant such a central part of the political violence conversation?
Active assailant has become the primary media point that we're seeing largely, especially here in the United States and North America, because I don't want to just limit it to the United States. We've just recently seen a few incidents in Canada also that are attributable to this same type of risk. Unfortunately, as you said, using the word, unfortunately, active assailants now it's the weather system. It's the predictor over political violence. It is political violence plus, because what we're seeing with active assailants, more frequent, less ideological, and far harder to predict than the headline-driven risk of the past. Active assailant is not a large terror event that claims hundreds or thousands of lives. It is a slow drip of a faucet that claims 1, 2, 3, 4 lives daily. And what we're seeing is the motivation has shifted. Violence is increasingly non-ideological. It's driven by personal grievance or broader societal tension. Today's most serious incidents sit outside what traditional terrorism would even look at or consider. Frequency risk has changed, where terrorism is a very catastrophic event that occurs and normally affects multiple insureds in a given area. Active assailant's normally a single insured or a single space. It can spread beyond that. It's smaller scale, it's localized, and it's far, far, far less headline driven than terrorism. Targeting is more sophisticated, even if the weapons aren't. So targeting, we have people with the ability to use social media to find where someone is at, the ability to track specific targets, or to know where a certain group of people you dislike are. It's becoming more common. So we're seeing location sharing, digital footprints. It's all being connected and bringing into this idea that active assailant is a risk that's beyond just a high profile area that could be attacked. And then finally, we're finding clients just need response, not just cover. So we're looking at beyond just the traditional insurance policies that say we will indemnify you, we will make you whole from what happened. We're saying we're going to help you in those crucial moments that happen when an active assailant attacks. So instead of that crisis management, the communication support, clarity response, it's going to the center of the political violence conversation rather than the edges. And, here at Markel, we view active assailant as complementary, as not competing coverages with terrorism. And we often work together, and we want to make sure that the idea that frequency sits over, in some ways, almost more important than what severity could be, because frequency is what's going to determine how we look at the book.
I think Josh really outlined it perfectly. And from the underwriting and insurance perspective, I'd like to maybe also share a different perspective around how rise in technology and digital information networks really played a big part in this being really visible for greater exposure to these events that are taking place, and how that kind of made people more risk averse. And we do also see the rise in demand for our product because everyone wants more visibility. This is a very unpredictable peril to insure, as Joshua highlighted in his response. So I think that's why people seeing these events happening, whether it's unfortunately in the form of a school shooting, in the form of an event where like a single political figure is targeted. So people see these play out 24/7, not only on news outlets, but also on social media with the rise of, information networks, everyone having access. So organizations and individuals are more prone to these and like more aware of this. And that, I think, really challenges their risk appetite. And therefore they're seeking more insurance and seeking more protection and seeking more ways from the insurer's perspective, more ways to handle their portfolio and have visibility because of the rise and the frequency of these events. So definitely in the past 5-6 years, with the unfortunately predominance of these smaller attacks or big scale attacks, really resulted in a shift in human behavior and the risk appetite. And we're seeing that manifest itself both in the world of insurtech and underwriting insurance.
Well, let's spend some time talking about what makes active assailant different. And it really is different, I think, the more you delve into this peril, certainly from traditional terrorism, but even from the other kind of newer aspects within PV, like strikes, rights, civil commotion, civil unrest type events as a peril, sort of hybrid war aspects where you've got sabotage to terrorism. This, I think, is a whole different thing. So let's look about what makes it so different. Coverage, triggers, portfolio exposures. So I'll try and distill that down into a bit of a manageable question for Josh. How do you define active assailant in underwriting terms, Josh? And how is that fundamentally different from a traditional terrorism policy that you already mentioned it requires usually as an ideological motive?
Active assailant is about action. It's not ideology, as you mentioned. It's immediate, individual, and inherently unpredictable. So active assailant is, how we look at it is it's one person intent on causing harm to another person with some sort of weapon. A lot of times, especially here in the United States, we view active assailant as active shooter, as using a gun or some type of firearm, and it's beyond that. We've seen in the UK, we've even seen here knife attacks, things of that nature.
Would it include, for example, using vehicles as weapons?
Absolutely. I mean, here in the US, a terrorist attack is normally what we see as a large event. Active assailant is normally a smaller event. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but it's what has traditionally been seen. So, yeah, motivation, I mean, any type of weapon, vehicle, explosive, anything handheld. A phrase that I've used a few times is that sometimes a hardened piece of bread, when is a baguette not just a baguette, it can be used as a weapon if the intent is to harm someone else. But the big difference is between terrorism and active assailant is motivation. That's the defining difference. Active assailant doesn't require that intent, that political, religious, or ideological intent. It can just be someone who's intent on harming one other person. So we see active assailant as that gray space between a traditional GL policy, a traditional property policy, and what a terrorism policy or a traditional political violence policy may cover. Because a GL is more sudden, accidental. Property is more sudden, accidental. Terrorism is very ideologically motivated. So we're looking at someone who is intent on causing harm and providing a coverage for that. And it's frequency led, not severity led. The most recent gun violence archive said since January 26th, there have been 51 mass shootings and 4 acts of mass murder in the US. We probably, unless you're watching the local news every single day of every single city in the United States, you probably will not hear about most of those. So it's not the big name events that we're seeing. It's these smaller events that happen that is defining what active assailant is. And like cyber was 10, 15 years ago, it's an ever evolving definition of how we view it. It went from 3 or 4 people needed to be injured or killed to now we're seeing one person on one person. and it reflects how violence manifests today. Our underwriting in our space focuses on what happened, a targeted act involving a weapon rather than why someone did it, which is often unclear or unknowable in real time. So we like to underwrite to behavior, not belief.
A question based on things that you said and something that inadvertently I said. So when thinking about, I used the examples of those marauding vehicle attacks in Europe on Christmas markets a year or two ago. I forget which winter it was, but they were terrorism in the sense that there was an Islamist terrorist motive there. So perhaps that's more of a straightforward terrorism event rather than active assailant. Well, that's a question in itself, but also, does it matter really in the sense that if you're buying this package as a policy, then it would be a political violence policy, which would include terrorism and active assailant. So whether the event was classified as terrorism by the local government authorities wouldn't matter too much, provided you did buy a broader policy that was not just terrorism, it was active assailant, political violence.
Correct. And a lot of terrorism policies don't provide that crisis management coverage that's going to come with an active assailant policy. So what you're getting is you may have the liability or the property damage covered by a terrorism policy, and then your active assailant policy is coming in and providing your crisis response costs. Because that, again, that is where expertise is needed and where most people don't have expertise, at least on hand. Small businesses, mid-sized businesses that are located in these areas probably don't have a PR team, probably don't have a crisis management firm on retainer. And what this policy provides is essentially that. It's someone who can step in and help you lead you through that crisis when it happens.
If we think about this as a package policy and you've got elements of liability, but also property damage and business interruption, and yeah, the crisis management service is like the core of it rather than a sort of add-on to it. It really is the core of what it's there to do. So can you just walk us through what typically sits inside the coverage and yeah, why that first hour response is so critical?
Most active assailant policies are going to have your standard, this is your liability, your third party liability, covers bodily injury to a third party. It's going to provide a property damage, a business interruption aspect. Standard policies, what we see normally in the market, that you're combining it's a true package. It's providing both casualty and property. Where they stand out different and where I feel like the difference is when you have a policy that's a package like this is your crisis management, is your response cost. What we really see active assailant insurance is less of an insurance policy and more of a playbook designed to respond, like you said, in that first chaotic hour, not just reconcile losses months later. We're genuinely multi-line by design. We deal with property, we deal with casualty, we deal with crisis response. We're dealing, sometimes in some cases, we're dealing with accident and health, if there's a personal injury that may have occurred. But essentially, crisis management is central, not optional. It's what we view as the core of what we offer in our product that differentiates between a GL, a property, a terrorism policy. And as you said, first hour shapes that outcome. Early decisions around safety, messaging, and coordination often determine not just on the ground what's happening, but long-term financial, legal, and reputational impact, which is huge for most clients and exactly the expertise that most active assailant policies and the crisis management providers try to provide. And it mirrors the evolution we're seeing in cyber. Cyber insurance, it evolved in the last 20 years. An active assailant has been around for 10 to 15 years, possibly, if that long. And it was evolved from what was a passive indemnity to an active policy that's actively working with clients and brokers as partners to find the best way to both prevent and protect.
You've already mentioned that active assailant is not predominantly the headline grabbing shootings or terrorist type events that we might see, but the ones that we often don't because they're smaller or they just don't make the nightly news. So how should we think about severity versus frequency in this space? And what does that mean for, as an underwriter, your pricing, your aggregates, your limits, that kind of stuff?
We underwrite to the frequency, not the severity, as you mentioned. In active assailant, it's less about the earthquake and more about the aftershocks. Lower severity events, far greater frequency, and that's what's reshaping pricing and limits constantly in our field. We're constantly having to reevaluate how much limit you're going to put out because one active assailant event could be super severe, but you could have also 5 losses of a less severe nature that could eat up the exact same amount of limit. Just statistics that are out there. Rockefeller Institute of Government, it's a think tank. The average number of deaths in a public mass shooting So this is somebody using a weapon, and in public is 3.4 people killed and 5.3 injured. Since 1967, that's average in the US. So if we're expanding that to other weapons, we're expanding that to a private setting, your numbers are actually going to get smaller. So the average loss that we're seeing in a shooting or an attack is not, again, the headline grabbing events that we have seen in the past. It's not multiples killed. It's normally one or two or three. While those still can be shock losses, depending on what the circumstances are, it's more of we realize that these losses are going to accumulate, not explode. It's going to be my business was shut down for 2 weeks. So there's business interruption costs that come along with that. We understand that there's crisis costs that come along with that are not normally taken into account by budget or a small, medium, or even some large companies. And so our pricing, we tend to look at reflects probability, not publicity. We look at multitude of factors to take into account to see if there is a propensity for certain acts of violence that may occur or a political hotbed of some sort. And limits are becoming more calibrated. We work with our buyers to look at realistic loss scenarios, and we look at limits. Buyers are balancing, realistic loss scenarios versus their budget, and what insurers like Markel or any other insurer out there can provide. As a peer network, we are always looking at what's the best option that we can provide out for our clients in a worldwide and especially on a domestic basis here in the US.
So I wanted to spend a little bit of time, not too long, but just looking at some legislative developments. And firstly, TRIA, because we've talked about terrorism already and the either differentiating or the overlap between active assailant and terrorism. So first of all, it'd be good to get a US perspective just to summarize what has happened lately with regards to TRIA and how relevant is it? Does it respond meaningfully to the kind of events that we're talking about here? Or is active assailant filling a gap that terrorism wordings and federal backstops just simply don't address?
TRIA is coming up for renewal 2027. It is in a legislative process. Of course, we never know what's going to happen in our legislative process here in the US, but we are expecting that it most likely will be renewed. TRIA is a safety net. It was designed as a safety net after the tremendous losses that came to the insurance industry post September 11th back in 2001, when insurance companies started to exclude terrorism on their standard forms, which was not even considered a risk in most cases when underwriting. TRIA is the safety net for ideology-driven catastrophe. Active assailant, as we're discussing today, is the coverage responding to everyday violence that never reaches the threshold that TRIA would have. TRIA is structurally narrow. It requires a motivation. It requires a declaration by the government that it was a terrorist event. It requires a certain limit to be hit, which looks to be increasing in current legislation. Most active assailant events and most what we would consider terrorism events that happened in the US since September 11th do not reach that threshold. Big name events that are called terrorist events were not declared terrorist events by the government because it didn't hit the financial threshold that needed to be hit in order for TRIA to be brought about. And TRIA is often bought for compliance. It's required through a lot of lending. And so it's not exposure necessarily. While it is still looked at with a lens of it's more expensive, this is area prone to terrorism, it's not underwritten the same way that we were underwriting either a standalone terrorism policy or even an active assailant policy. There hasn't been a TRIA triggering claim ever. We provide reality-based coverage when it comes with active assailant or even standalone terrorism. So we see active assailant as closing the gap. I think in some cases, TRIA might be the best option for someone to purchase with terrorism. And then whatever is missing in there, an active assailant policy can only come in and be the water that covers the gaps in the sandcastle to help it fill. So again, we're about the gap closing approach. It's finding those gray areas that maybe aren't covered on the traditional policy and not covered through a TRIA purchase that can help provide affirmative coverage that will definitely respond within that parameters of what our policy rights.
So a state level legislative and regulatory question now. So we've seen workplace violence requirements in states like California and New York. Hasn't related to inquiries or demand for the product. Do you expect more regulatory momentum to grow this market?
I think regulation, it hasn't created the risk, but it's accelerated awareness, and awareness is what turns exposure into demand. It's created some inquiries. They feel like they need to have something in place in order to help protect and show a duty of care to their people, to their employees. legislation sharpened the focus. Workplace violence requirements in states like California and New York, they've pushed active assailant risk onto boardroom and risk manager agendas with people who don't normally see that. Recent reports have come out. Last 5 years, OSHA in 2023 said there were 740 fatalities due to violence. 62% of those were homicides. SBA report out of Michigan in 2024, and this one shocked me. 1 in 4 employees have been witness to workplace violence. And then even last year, the American Hospital Association said that workplace violence costs hospitals more than $18 billion annually. So it's not just a specific industry. While we have statistics related to those, we're seeing it in a general sense that it's workplace violence, which includes active assailant risk, is increasing in the United States. And with the recent shifts, what we're seeing with California and New York is they're accelerators. They're not originators of demand. And we're realizing that education follows regulation. So my job is education just as much now as going in and actually providing the coverage that they need. It's having the conversations. And I agree. I think momentum's likely to continue. I think we'll see more states. And I've seen draft legislation for several states that have come out. I think that we'll start seeing a regulation aspect of this happening on a more nationwide scale here in the United States. And I think it will continue to grow.
A different question for both of you now, but it's kind of not entirely unrelated. So rather than looking at the big pieces of legislative change and rather look at news events as a motivation for buyers, So, you've seen things like there was an insurance CEO assassinated end of 2024, the United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson. And then there was very well publicized political assassinations like Charlie Kirk being murdered on a campus while speaking to students. But lots of other obviously big high profile events as well. They're just a couple that stick out. And what I'm interested in is how those events influence insured's perception of active assailant risk, their behavior, their buying behavior, brokers as well, and ultimately demand for buying this sort of protection.
I think Joshua really gave us a really good breakdown of like the rise in demand and like how the changing, sort of behavioral elements and legislation are driving the active assailant policies. This is a very relevant question in today's world. Unfortunately, as we are seeing the, a rise in these extremist sort of ways of public executions, like the CEO of the United Health and then Charlie Kirk, as you mentioned, I think looking at those events play out 24/7 again on the news and social media outlets, everyone has access to what has happened, video footage, literally. You're reminded the fragility of human life on a daily basis, more so than ever. So I think, again, I want to refer back to my point that I made early on, that insurers are becoming more risk averse and they're seeking active assailant. Maybe Joshua can speak to this more, but as an add-on, I've seen as a person who works with PVNT underwriters and in this insurtech platform, a lot of underwriters and insurers are combining active assailant with other perils like SNT. So I see a lot of combined wordings. That's something I've witnessed in the past 2 years at least. So that's a common trend because there is that demand, because there's insurers going out there, like organizations, employers, they're seeking this as an add-on to their policies because they're hyper-aware of the risks. And I think, again, these high-profile events, as you pointed out, rightfully so, play a really big part in that behavior and how it's shaped the risk appetite.
You're right. I think they're shifting the behavior, shifting the viewpoint, even though they may not directly trigger cover. Headlines don't have to hit the balance sheet to move behavior. They bend the risk compass. They bring out that this could happen to me in the minds of risk managers, in the minds of boards, in the minds of your everyday person. I think we all prepare for the black swan event, but it's the gray rhino next door that we miss sometimes. And so, major attacks recalibrate that risk perception, even without triggering a specific cover that we would have. High profile incidents, they shorten like we said, that distance between this will never happen to me to this is possible. And with today's media environment, it used to be, well, that happened in 200 miles away. It will never affect me. Now it's constantly playing over and over in front of someone's eyes to help create the perception of risk that's there. And the nature of violence is shifting. These two attacks were ideological that you mentioned prior. We're seeing it becoming more non-ideological, more low-tech, more unpredictable. Someone who has an unrelated issue coming to attack a soft target of what they may see, something that's directly in front of them instead of seeking out what it may be. While they're also getting more sophisticated, it's about the targeting. It's about, we're also seeing people being more micro targeted for what needs to happen. I think that played out in both incidents that you talked about, that these were targeted events. And while they may not have been directly related to a commercial insurance policy of some sort, they still bring out the aspect of, again, this could happen to me rather than this is something that will never happen. And I think that's why we've seen these dynamics drive demand for standalone active assailant coverage, because it responds without having that ideological threshold. So it will respond to an ideological attack, but it's going to respond to the random guy with a weapon attacking a random location. So again, education first is in these instances, we're not going to sell off fear. I don't want any of my insureds to come to me out of fear of what may happen, but we're going to sell off education of saying this is how we can work with you to both show these are rare but growing, but also this is how we can help put preventative measures in place to help prevent something from happening, but also will respond if that black swan or whatever event may occur.
Let's spend some time talking about the data gap, underwriting tools, AI, and real-time risk visibility. So despite the fact this is a peril that's high frequency, it does feel as though there's a lack of data, or perhaps it's not being found, or it's not being turned into analysis enough. Josh, for our traditional data, such as crime scores, the starting point here, or if I'm leading you a bit there, what are the key data that you would use? And what are the gaps you face when trying to underwrite this, as opposed to just relying on gut feel?
Traditional data, it's a baseline. It's not going to be a conclusion for us. So your crime scores, they're a compass. They're not the map. When you look at them, they point you in a direction, but underwriting active assailant risk still requires, as you said, that gut feel, the judgment, context, and a degree of human interpretation. I still have to look at a risk and determine, because modeling an active assailant risk is difficult because you're modeling both a frequency and a catastrophe at the same time of what could occur. The biggest gaps are behavioral and situational. There's limited structural data around grievance or social tension or how exposed a location is due to routine footfall or visibility. I think that the last part, how exposed the location is, probably can be modeled better, but grievance and social tension are very real-time events that are hard to model outside of some historical context in some cities. So in active assailant risk is highly location specific. So two locations in the same area that would have the same crime score could be vastly different in how I view and how an underwriter may view those two locations. So it is hyper local in many ways compared to a crime score may give you a general idea for a zip code or for a mile or 2 mile radius. And locations can be vastly different within that 1 or 2 mile radius. But human judgment remains central to our underwriting philosophy. Data is our starting point. Data is my foundation, but I have to interpret that data. I have to rely on open source intelligence, pattern recognition, and just honestly experience of dealing with these risks to look at them and say, is this higher risk compared to A, B, C, D, so on? We work closely with third-party intelligence providers here at Markel to not only keep our finger on the pulse of the latest developments, but also we can identify, assess, and price risk accordingly for a geography or territory in question. It gives us that general idea, and then we have to do our own deep dives ourselves in order to provide the data to help us make the actual judgment that needs to occur.
I definitely agree with your point, Josh, where the data is the starting point, the baseline, and you still need a human in the loop and human judgment. As you know, what I'm working in Concirrus, our product is a way to empower and as a complementary tool. Same goes to AI tools that we have, Gen AI tools that are available. So I kind of want to ask you a follow-up question. How much of your current underwriting practices do you think data-driven versus judgment-driven in a ballpark figure? Because you said you're working with third-party data vendors and, these modeling software. So, if you have to give a percentage or like a ballpark figure, how much of that is data-driven versus judgment-driven?
Great question. I think it depends. Sometimes I like to say it's 60-40 data and judgment. I think sometimes it depends on how much data is out there. If I don't have a lot of data, it may be a 30-70, where 30% is data and 70% is judgment driven. I think we aim for 50-50. I think that's our ultimate goal, is to have at least enough data to give us a baseline to view around. But always being open to finding more data sources, the greater ability to dive into something and analyze it and find the numbers that help us determine and model and see what type of risk should be rated, should be written, should be priced, what limits should be given, all important considerations. And as an underwriter, we'll always take more data sources than probably are available at this point. But it definitely, for me at least, I would like to see more. I guess that's the best answer I can provide, is the ability to have more data, to be able to have more points of reference to go back to help either challenge or validate the gut feeling or judgment underwriting that I'm providing.
Gamze, a question for you then, a related one. From a tech perspective, how can a platform integrate those different data and analytics?
This question, really ties really well with our discussion. It also really excites me because the potential and possibility here are endless, so to speak. Every single day, there's a new data vendor or new third-party tool that arises. I'm not just talking about high-profile data providers that we all know and currently probably use in the market. But there are a lot of innovation. The rate of innovation is just very remarkable. And we do at Concirrus work with a lot of data providers up and coming that currently, for example, I cannot name names because some of them work with governments as well, but let's say to track the mobility data, right? To get the peak occupancy data of, let's say you're insuring a hotel chain. Some of them are not occupied full time. Some of them are. You can see that fluctuation through the real life occupancy data that this third-party tool provides, or the news feed, right? We're not showing you all the news. We're showing you the news that you're supposed to see because those are the areas that you're covering under your policy. So it's about not how much data that we provide, but how we provide that data to you via integrations, the valuable insights, right? So I think that's what sets our integrations apart, is to really understand the pain points and target it towards that. So I would say we're at a cusp of change in the industry where the static data is being replaced by real life data and exposure management tools. And integrations with third-party tools or other platforms just unlock the potential of not only your own portfolio data, but also all the open source data that are out there. Most of these vendors are using open source data, even ChatGPT, Google Gemini, all of them are using the available data out there. And our aim via these integrations is to get that data and present it in a form that underwriters can utilize to assess unpredictable risk, like active assailant. Potentially, you can scrape social media for behavioral indicators or court records, law enforcements based on the jurisdiction area that you're covering. Again, as I said, total peak occupancy exposure via tracking mobility data. So the opportunity here is endless to decode complexity and give you, as Joshua said, that power to underwrite more confidently. And you can expand your portfolio, diversify it again with all those insights. So it is really endless. I can talk hours about it, but I'm not going to do that. Dave, thank you so much for facilitating this, because I feel like it's a focus group for me to really have. And I'm kind of asking Joshua a lot of questions, but these are really valuable insights. What data, because you mentioned the data tools you use, and you can never have more data than you need. You can always utilize more data. So my question is around that. What data do you wish you had now when underwriting PV or specifically active assailant risk right now that you don't have, or you have, but you think you're at the tip of the iceberg, you're just scratching the surface, you can still do more with that?
All of it? Does that work? I think for me, what data do I wish I had? I think jokingly precognition, know what's going to happen before it happens. But I think truthfully, it's, that real-time ability to have the pulse of what's happening in the environment, not just in a societal global scale, but a very what's happening in this area of this city that could be affected, to help prevent some of the unpredictable of what happens out there. For us, it's really trying to find the data of what predicts an event, as much as it's unpredictable, as much as some of them are just random because they're random. And so I think having that data, having, as you mentioned, the ability to kind of know occupancy and peak occupancy. If a place of business is more occupied at 4 a.m. than they are at 4 p.m., that's a much more higher risk classification to me. If a certain area is more active and we're seeing an increase in police calls or activity in that area at certain hours, that's a higher risk. And I think that would play into an idea of what an active assailant, at least an attempt at predicting the unpredictable. So those are data sources. I think the ability to have real-time data and the ability to look at more micro data are probably two of our biggest key things that will help eventually as we are continuing learning how to model events that are rare but catastrophic.
Thank you for that, Josh. And I think real life data, again, thanks for putting that emphasis on the real life data. That's something we currently aim to provide with these integrations and unlocking your portfolio data to give you insights on your analytic tools and portfolio MI tools to really give you that visibility. The precognition one, when you said that, I was thinking about this movie. I don't know if you saw it, Minority Report.
Absolutely. That was in my head.
I was thinking about, wait, be careful what you ask for. The cat modeling systems nowadays that we have, they're predominantly used in the market, are more catered towards natural catastrophe modeling, like earthquakes, fires, flood zone risk, and all that stuff. So do you think there's a gap between the cat sci modeling expectations and what is realistically modelable in PVNT today?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think in some ways, terrorism is a little easier to model. You have a blast radius idea of what could be affected within a certain amount of square footage or certain meters from the location. I think that there's data that can help back up that. I think that growing, we're seeing it more and more, becoming a more refined science rather than art. I think it's harder to model what a loss could be due to an active assailant attack because it could be 1-on-1, it could be 1-on-10 when it comes to perpetrator versus victim. It could be 10-on-1. You just never know what that's going to be. So I think cat modeling, we're limited. And I don't know if it will ever be something that is completely predictable when it comes to our catastrophe modeling. Again, it's a gut feel. It's a what is the possibility of what this loss could be, and looking, data like historical claims, not claims, but even losses like court, this is how much this was settled for, this is how much was required by the court to pay out. In certain areas can help determine, hey, if we have a loss here, even if it's 1-on-1, it may be a full limit loss. And so we have to rate and find a point of determination when it comes to that. Is this an area that's going to be more prone to having a larger loss due to the way the court systems are set up? But yeah, I definitely think, most claims for active assailant are smaller. They're not going to be full limit losses most of the time. And I think there's less data out there on them at this point. So I think it's harder to model. I think it's something it's a frequency thing rather than, I think CAT takes into account what's going to happen in those major moments. And I think it's possible. I think it's just gathering the data is going to be a longer process. It's less historical data out there on that than there is on hurricanes for 200 years or fires that happen in certain type of buildings. And so again, as a more rare thing that occurs, I think that cat modeling is a growing field for that area. I think it will inherently be limited though in the long run.
Josh, yeah, kind of fun question. If you could design the ideal dashboard for active assailant underwriting, what would you put in it?
That's a great question. And now I can get my wish list out. The ideal dashboard doesn't just show the individual risk. So it's not just going to show the one thing that you're looking at. We want it to reveal the rhythm of the whole book, to look at a single clear view of exposure by location, showing limits, TIV, occupancy, and aggregation at local and regional levels to highlight connection. We're in a very connected world, so one loss here may affect the loss at this other location. I think it separates active assailant exposure from other political violence risk. I think that's one of those things that isn't seen a lot, especially when you were looking at how underwriting works in a lot of areas, especially in ours. Strong aggregation across the nationwide books, it's going to help us.
How can better aggregation and marginal impact analysis improve your exposure management then across the book?
Strong aggregation, we have a nationwide book. It'll help us identify where exposure is building to see trends of where we're seeing increases in certain areas. And it helps support consistent risk control. So we work within our internal teams to find ways to help prevent those black swan events that may occur in larger concentration areas. In marginal impact analysis, it's going to show us how each additional risk changes overall exposure. So it's adding this large location in here. How does that affect the rest of my book? In regionally, city, zip, but also nationally. And it helps improve my judgment as an underwriter on whether risk fits the book as a whole. And it helps us as as an insurance company, see if we're effectively using our capacity, capital, and reassurance to help protect that. It helps create an operational efficiency. It gains that, and that, again, portfolio awareness is a core underwriting discipline. So it helps give me an insight into not just what I'm writing as an individual, but what my team is writing on a national basis.
Just to wrap, I agree with everything Josh said. Everything everywhere all at once. We want to see the occupancy, the TIV, expected loss, prior event history, risk scores in one go. And we do have our aggregations and marginal impact checks in place currently on our platforms. And I think just want to highlight one thing before we wrap everything up, is that I think marginal impact and aggregations are two of the most powerful but underused tools in active assailant. We talked today that AA is not a single sort of large catastrophe event peril, but it's more of the combination of frequency, clustering, and density problem, which I think aggregation analysis can give underwriters that visibility over their portfolio and the problem around accumulation creep. So just wanted to add that from the tech perspective, but overall really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for having us, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
And that concludes this special episode, produced in association with Concirrus. I'd like to thank my two expert guests for this episode, Gamze Tekin and Joshua Watson. Until next time, thank you for listening, and please tune in again. I've been your host, David Benyon. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.